Bikers extort elderly woman's bakery, unaware her Navy grandson just returned from service. The small town of Brookside had always been a quiet place. Tucked away in the rolling hills of Montana, it was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where life moved at a slow and steady pace. The centerpiece of Main Street was Margaret Dawson's Bakery, Dawson's Delights, a cozy little shop with a red and white awning and the warm, welcoming scent of fresh bread and pastries spilling onto the sidewalk every morning. For over 30 years, Margaret had poured her heart into the place, waking up before dawn to knead dough and perfect her famous cinnamon rolls. But the town had changed. Over the past few months, a dark shadow had fallen over Brookside. A group of bikers, known as the Iron Serpents, had rolled in and made themselves at home in an abandoned garage just outside town. What started as a rowdy group hanging around the local bar had turned into something much worse. Businesses began getting unexpected visitors, tattooed men in leather jackets demanding protection money. First, it was the gas station, then the grocery store. And now, they had set their sights on Dawson's Delights. Margaret stood behind the counter, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron as the doorbell jingled. She forced a polite smile as two men entered, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek, stepped forward while the other lingered by the door, his arms crossed over his chest. "Good morning, gentlemen," Margaret greeted, keeping her voice steady despite the unease settling in her stomach. "What can I get for you today?" The scarred man grinned, but there was no warmth in it. "We're not here for the pastries, lady. We're here for business." Margaret's fingers tightened around the towel she was holding. She had heard the rumors, had seen the worried faces of her fellow shopkeepers. "I don't want any trouble." The second man chuckled. "That's exactly why you should listen to what we're offering." The first man leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A little insurance, see? Just a few hundred a week, and we make sure nothing bad happens. No broken windows, no stolen cash registers. Just peace of mind." Margaret swallowed hard. "I'm an old woman running a bakery. I don't have that kind of money." Scar grinned wider. "That's a shame, Miss Dawson. You wouldn't want to see this place go up in flames, would you?" The threat was clear, and fear coiled tight in Margaret's chest. She had poured everything into this bakery. Her late husband had helped her buy the space, and her grandson had grown up running through these aisles. She refused to be bullied out of it. But what could she do? As the men turned to leave, Scar tossed a small card onto the counter. "We'll be back in 3 days. Have the money ready." Margaret stared at the card, her hands trembling. She had to find a way to fight back. But who could she turn to? 200 miles away, Logan Dawson was staring at the sky from the window of a Greyhound bus. The rolling Montana landscape looked exactly as he remembered it. Endless fields stretching toward the horizon, the occasional cluster of trees breaking up the open space. After 6 years in the Navy, the idea of returning home felt strange. He had seen things most people couldn't imagine, had faced dangers that had hardened him into a different man. And yet, despite everything, his heart still ached for home. He had promised Grandma Margaret he would return. After his mother's passing, she had been the one to raise him, to teach him right from wrong. While he had been overseas, her letters had been a lifeline, always filled with updates on the bakery, on the neighbors, and on how proud she was of him. But her last letter had been different. Something was wrong. She hadn't said it outright, but Logan could read between the lines. The words had been careful, too careful, and she had ended the letter with a simple, "I miss you, Logan." More than ever. He had packed his bag the same night. As the bus pulled into the Brookside station, Logan stepped off with his duffel slung over one shoulder. His military haircut was still fresh, and his posture carried the rigid discipline of a man trained for war. But as he took in the familiar streets, something inside him softened. Home. He walked through town, nodding to old neighbors who barely recognized him at first, but then broke into smiles. But something felt off. The town was quieter than he remembered. People walked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. A sense of unease lingered in the air. When he finally reached Dawson's Delights, The door was locked. That was unusual. Margaret never closed this early. A prickle of concern ran down his spine as he knocked. The door opened a crack, and his grandmother's tired eyes widened in shock. "Logan's." "Hey, Grandma," he said softly. Before he could say another word, she threw the door open and pulled him into a tight embrace. "Oh, my boy, you're home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He held her for a long moment before gently pulling back to look at her. "Grandma, what's going on?" Margaret sighed, glancing nervously at the windows before locking the door behind him. She motioned for him to sit at the small table in the corner of the shop. "I didn't want to worry you while you were away," she admitted, pouring them both a cup of tea. "But things have been difficult." As she told him everything, the threats, the bikers, the fear that had crept into her daily life, Logan felt something cold settle in his chest. His hands curled into fists on the table, his jaw tightening with every word. "No one's done anything?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Margaret shook her head. "The sheriff is scared of them." "Most people are." Logan exhaled sharply. "Well, they haven't met me." Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "Logan, I don't want you getting hurt. They're dangerous men." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Logan's face. "So am I." As night fell over Brookside, the Iron Serpents gathered at the bar on the edge of town, laughing and drinking as they celebrated another day of easy money. None of them noticed the tall, broad-shouldered man watching from the shadows. Logan Dawson had been trained for war, and he was ready to bring the fight to them. The quiet town of Fairview had always felt like a safe haven, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors still borrowed cups of sugar from one another. But lately, a dark shadow had settled over Main Street, creeping in like an unwelcome storm. It started small, just a few rough-looking bikers loitering outside Lillian's hearth, their leather jackets heavy with patches and skull emblems. At first, Lillian had thought nothing of it. She'd seen plenty of tough-looking men in her 77 years, and most were far kinder than their appearance suggested. But as the days passed, the group became a constant presence, and their intentions grew clearer. One brisk morning, as Lillian pulled a tray of golden brown croissants from the oven, the bakery bell jingled. She turned with a warm smile, but it faded the moment she saw who had entered. A burly man with a long, unkempt beard and cold, dark eyes stood before her. His leather vest bore the name, stitched in faded red thread. Behind him, two other bikers leaned against the bakery walls, their arms crossed over their chests. "Morning, ma'am," the bearded man drawled, his voice thick with a southern twang. "You got a real nice place here." Lillian wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and forced herself to stay composed. "Why, thank you. Can I get you boys something?" "Fresh out of the oven." The man smirked, taking a step closer. "That depends, Miss Lillian. See, me and my boys, we're looking out for local businesses. Keeping things safe. But safety don't come free, you know?" Lillian stiffened. "I'm afraid I don't understand." One of the bikers chuckled darkly. The bearded man leaned on the counter, his expression turning cold. "It's real simple, ma'am. You pay us a little fee each week, and in return, we make sure nothing bad happens to your shop." Her grip tightened on the counter's edge. She had lived through hardships, her husband's passing, raising her grandson alone, and keeping her business afloat through tough times. But she had never faced outright extortion. "I don't need protection," she said firmly. "Fairview is a safe town." The man sighed as if disappointed. "That's the thing, Miss Lillian. It was safe. But lately accidents happen." With a deliberate motion, he reached for a croissant from the tray, crushed it in his massive hand, and let the crumbs scatter across the counter. "You have until next Friday," he murmured. "$500 a week. And don't think about calling the cops. That'd be a mistake." With that, the three men turned and sauntered out, leaving only the lingering scent of leather and cigarette smoke behind. Lillian's heart pounded. $500 a week. That was more than she made some months. She refused to be bullied, but she also knew these men were dangerous. She needed help, and she knew exactly who to call. Hundreds of miles away, Danny Carter had just set foot on American soil. The sharp scent of jet fuel and salt water clung to him as he stepped off the naval carrier, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His deployment had been long, grueling, and dangerous, but nothing compared to the warmth he felt at the thought of coming home. His grandmother had been his rock ever since he was a boy. When his parents died in a car accident, it was Lillian who had raised him, teaching him the value of hard work, kindness, and resilience. He couldn't wait to see her. But as soon as he turned on his phone, a wave of messages flooded his screen, dozens from townspeople and one from Lillian herself. "Something bad is happening. I need you. Please come." His stomach twisted. Whatever it was, he'd handle it. By sundown, Danny was back in Fairview, standing in the warm glow of Lillian's hearth. His grandmother gasped when she saw him. "Danny!" He caught her in a firm hug, inhaling the familiar scent of sugar and cinnamon. But he could feel how frail she'd become. Her frame trembled slightly. "What's going on?" he asked, pulling back to look into her tired blue eyes. She hesitated, then gestured for him to sit. Over a cup of steaming coffee, she told him everything. Danny listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. By the time she finished, his hands had curled into fists. "They threatened you?" His voice was dangerously low. Lillian nodded. "I told them I wouldn't pay, but I don't know what they'll do next." Danny exhaled slowly. His military training had taught him how to deal with threats, but this was personal. "No one is going to hurt you, Grandma," he said, his tone steely. "I'll take care of it." The next day, Danny wasted no time. He spoke to the sheriff, a longtime family friend, but the man admitted that his hands were tied. The Iron Serpents had a reputation for disappearing before arrests could be made. "They're slippery," the sheriff admitted. "But if you can get proof, something solid, we'll take them down." Danny nodded grimly. If the law wouldn't handle it, he would. The next evening, he stationed himself inside the bakery, waiting. Sure enough, just before closing, the Iron Serpents returned. This time, there were 5 of them. The bearded leader grinned when he saw Lillian. "Hope you got our money, sweetheart." Danny stepped out from behind the counter. "She's not paying you a damn cent." The bikers tensed. The leader's grin faltered. "And who the hell are you?" Danny folded his arms, his stance unwavering. "Her grandson." Recognition flickered across the man's face. "The Navy boy." Danny smirked. "That's right." The leader chuckled, but there was an edge of uncertainty now. "Listen, hero, this ain't your fight. Walk away." Danny stepped closer, his gaze ice cold. "Or what? You gonna shake me down, too?" One of the bikers moved, as if to grab Danny's shoulder. In a flash, Danny twisted the man's arm behind his back and slammed him against the counter. The other surged forward, but Danny was faster. A precise kick sent one sprawling, and a sharp jab to another's gut doubled him over. Within seconds, 3 men were groaning on the ground. The leader took a cautious step back. "You just made a mistake." Danny wiped his hands. "No, you did, when you thought you could bully my grandmother." The biker scowled but motioned for his men to retreat. "This ain't over, Navy boy." Danny watched them go, his expression unreadable. He knew they'd be back. And next time, they wouldn't just ask for money. They'd be out for blood. As the days passed, the tension in Fairview thickened. The bikers retaliated, smashing Lillian's windows, slashing the bakery's tires, and spray-painting threats on the walls. But Danny didn't back down. Instead, he set traps, gathered evidence, and rallied the town against the Iron Serpents. What the bikers didn't know was that Danny had fought real enemies before, ones far more dangerous than a group of leather-clad thugs. And if they wanted a war, he'd give them one. Fairview had always been a quiet town, but tonight, a storm was brewing, not in the skies, but in the streets. Danny Carter stood in front of Lillian's hearth, his muscles tense, eyes scanning the shadows of Main Street. The Iron Serpents weren't finished. Their threats had escalated, windows smashed, tires slashed, and a final warning scrawled in red paint across the bakery's brick wall. Danny knew what that meant. They weren't just after money anymore. They wanted revenge. Inside the bakery, Lillian was frightened but resolute. She had never seen Danny like this before, his usual easy smile gone, replaced with the hardened expression of a man who had seen war and wasn't afraid to face another battle. "I don't want you to get hurt, Danny," she murmured. Danny placed a reassuring hand on hers. "I've handled worse. They're not taking this bakery from you. Not while I'm here." A deep rumbling sound echoed down the street. Engines. The iron serpents were coming. Danny's grip tightened into fists. "Stay inside, lock the doors. No matter what happens, don't open them until I say." Lillian hesitated, her heart pounding, but nodded. She turned the locks, watching through the blinds as darkness consumed the street. Danny stepped out onto the sidewalk. A dozen motorcycles lined up across the road, their headlights cutting through the night like glowing eyes of a predator. The riders dismounted one by one, more of them than before. Their leader, the bearded brute Danny had put on the ground last time, stood at the center, arms crossed. His name was, and he was known for making people disappear when they crossed him. Danny knew that tonight there were no more warnings. This was war. Jax took a step forward, his boots scraping against the pavement. "You got guts, Navy boy. I'll give you that." He gestured around him. "But guts won't save you tonight." Danny exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "I'm not the one who needs saving." Jax smirked. "Last chance. Walk away. Or we burn this place to the ground." Danny's jaw clenched. "Try it." Jax's smirk faded. He raised his hand, signaling his men. Two bikers charged. Danny was ready. The first man swung a crowbar, aiming for Danny's ribs. Danny sidestepped, catching the man's wrist and twisting sharply. The crowbar clattered to the ground as the biker cried out in pain. Before he could react, Danny drove a knee into his stomach and sent him sprawling. The second came at him with a knife. Danny pivoted, grabbing the man's arm and forcing the blade away. With a swift motion, he elbowed him in the face, sending the biker reeling backward, blood dripping from his nose. But the others weren't waiting. More bikers rushed him, fists flying. Danny blocked a punch, countered with a sharp hook to the jaw. Another man grabbed him from behind, but Danny threw his weight forward, flipping the biker over his shoulder. He moved with precision, trained reflexes guiding his every strike. Jax watched with narrowed eyes. His men, strong, street tough, outnumbering Danny, were being taken down one by one. Danny was good. Too good. Jax pulled a pistol from his belt. Enough games. The world slowed. Danny saw the gun the moment it was raised. Jax's finger curled around the trigger. A deafening bang split the night. Lillian screamed from inside. Danny dropped, rolling behind a parked car as the bullet shattered the bakery's front window. Jax cocked the gun again. "Come on out, Navy boys." Danny's mind raced. He needed to end this fast. Grabbing a metal trash lid from the curb, he flung it at Jax with all his strength. The makeshift shield slammed into the biker's wrist, knocking the gun loose. Danny moved. He closed the distance in an instant, grabbing Jax by the collar and slamming him into a lamppost. "You want to fight? You got one." Jax snarled, swinging wildly. Danny ducked, delivering a brutal uppercut that sent the biker stumbling. Jax wasn't used to losing. He reached for a knife, but Danny was faster. He grabbed Jax's arm, twisted it behind his back, and forced him onto the pavement, pinning him down. The rest of the bikers hesitated. Their leader was down. Their confidence wavered. That's when the wail filled the air. Sheriff Grayson's squad cars came screeching onto Main Street, red and blue lights flashing. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. "Freeze!" The remaining bikers scrambled, some trying to run, but there was nowhere to go. Within moments, they were surrounded, handcuffed, and shoved into the backs of patrol cars. Danny exhaled, keeping Jax pinned until the sheriff himself stepped over. "You're done, Maddox," Sheriff Grayson said, yanking Jax to his feet. "We've got enough on you to put you away for a long, long time." Jax spit blood onto the pavement, glaring at Danny. "This ain't over." Danny met his gaze, unshaken. "Yes, it is." The sheriff dragged Jax away, shoving him into a police cruiser. As the bikers were hauled off, the adrenaline began to fade. Danny turned toward the bakery. Lillian stood at the door, hands clasped tightly over her chest. Tears welled in her eyes. He walked over, his voice soft. "It's over, Grandma." She reached for him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Thank God you're home." Danny hugged her back, his grip firm but gentle. "Always." By dawn, the bakery was back in business. The shattered window had been boarded up, but inside, the scent of fresh bread and warm pastries filled the air as usual. The townspeople came in droves, not just for breakfast, but to support Lillian, to show her she wasn't alone. Danny sat at the counter, sipping coffee, exhaustion in his bones, but satisfaction in his heart. The sheriff pulled up a stool beside him. "You know, Carter, you could have called us before taking on a biker gang alone." Danny smirked. "Where's the fun in that?" The sheriff chuckled. "Well, either way, Fairview owes you one. Those guys have been a problem for a long time." He patted Danny on the shoulder. "You ever think of sticking around? Could use a guy like you." Danny glanced at Lillian, who was laughing with a customer. The weight of fear finally lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in years, the bakery felt truly safe. He took a slow sip of coffee. "Yeah," Danny said with a small smile. "I think I just might